Carolina, 1832. The night when 14 souls walked into the Blackwater swamp and vanished from history forever. No bodies were ever found. No traces left behind. Just empty shackles scattered across the mud like broken prayers, and a silence so deep it swallowed screams whole. This wasn't escape. This wasn't rebellion. This was something else entirely. Something that made grown men cross themselves and refuse to speak of what they'd seen in those dark waters. Her name was Celia, and she was the one who led them in. Not out. In. Deep into the belly of the swamp where cypress trees grew like cathedral spires and the water moved with its own hungry pulse. She was a root woman, a conjurer, someone who spoke the old language that came before chains, before ships, before the word property was branded into human flesh. And on that October night, as fog rolled across Magnolia Creek plantation like the breath of the dead, Celia gathered 13 others around her and whispered something that would echo through generations. They called it the Great Vanishing. The newspaper said it was suicide. The master said it was madness. But in the quarters, in the hushed spaces between cotton rows, they knew the truth. Celia hadn't led them to death. She'd led them to transformation, into something the white world couldn't touch, couldn't own, couldn't understand. They became part of the swamp itself, part of the ancient power that had been waiting in those waters long before the first slave ship touched American shores. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The air that night tasted of copper and secrets. October in South Carolina hung heavy and still, the kind of darkness that pressed against your skin like wet cloth. Magnolia Creek plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of rice fields and human misery, its white columns gleaming like teeth in the moonlight. But it was what lay beyond the fields that mattered most. The swamp, black water that stretched for miles, filled with things that had no names and memories older than America itself. Celia stood at the edge of the quarters, her bare feet planted in mud that had drunk the blood of her ancestors. She was 42 years old, her skin the color of burnt amber, her hair wrapped in cloth dyed with indigo and tears. Her hands knew secrets. They knew which roots could stop a heart, which leaves could heal a wound, which words could call up spirits from the water. She had learned from her grandmother, who had learned from hers, carrying knowledge across the ocean in their bones when their bodies were stolen from Africa. The other slaves feared her, not because she was cruel, but because she was powerful. Because when she looked at you, she saw not just flesh and bone, but spirit, soul. The part of you that couldn't be bought or sold, no matter what the auction block claimed. They whispered that she could walk on water, that she could speak to the dead, that she had made a pact with something ancient and terrible that lived in the deepest part of the swamp. None of that was entirely true, but none of it was entirely false either. Tonight, she had called them. 13 souls who carried wounds so deep they had forgotten their own names. Marcus, 19 years old, whose sister had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana and worked to death in 6 months. Sarah, 25, whose baby had been taken from her arms and sold before it could walk. Old Tom, 63, whose back was a map of scars carved by every overseer who had ever owned him. Each of them carried a piece of the same story: loss, pain, a rage so pure it had crystallized into something harder than diamond. They gathered in the shadow of the smokehouse where the scent of cured meat mixed with the smell of their own fear. No words were spoken. Celia simply looked at each of them, and they understood. This was not a meeting. This was a choosing, a decision that would echo through eternity. "Y'all know what this is," she said finally, her voice low as distant thunder. "Ain't no going back from where we headed." Marcus shifted his weight, chains around his ankles clinking softly. "They gonna come after us? Bring the dogs." Celia smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only certainty. "Dogs can't track where we goin', boy. Water don't hold scent. And what we becoming?" She paused, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. "Well, they ain't got chains for that." Sarah clutched her empty arms to her chest. "My baby. If I do this, I ain't never gonna see my baby again." "Child," Celia said gently, "you ain't never gonna see your baby again anyway. They done made sure of that. But this way you become something they can't never take, something they can't never break." The wind rustled through the rice stalks, carrying with it the sound of night birds and something else, something deeper. A rhythm like drum beats, like heartbeats, like the pulse of the earth itself. It was calling to them, had been calling for generations. One by one they nodded. One by one they chose. Celia reached into her apron and pulled out a small clay pot filled with dark water. Water from the heart of the swamp, where the roots of the cypress trees tangled together like fingers in prayer. She dipped her thumb into it and marked each forehead with a symbol that had never been written in any book, never been spoken by any tongue but those who remembered the old ways. "Drink," she commanded, passing the pot from hand to hand. Each one sipped the bitter water, tasting mud and moss and something older than memory. As it touched their lips, something changed in their eyes. A light went out. Another light came on. "Now," Celia said, "we walk." They moved like ghosts across the fields, 14 shadows against the starlight, past the rice paddies where they had worked until their hands bled, past the whipping post where they had watched friends die, past the big house where their masters slept fat and content, dreaming of profits calculated in human flesh. None of them looked back. There was nothing behind them worth seeing. At the edge of the swamp they stopped. The water stretched before them like a black mirror, reflecting nothing. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out a warning that went unheeded. Celia stepped into the water first. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, and it welcomed her like an old friend. The others followed, their chains now silent, as if the metal itself had grown reverent in this place. They walked deeper. The water rose to their ankles, their knees, their waists. Behind them, their footprints filled with black water and disappeared. Ahead of them, the swamp opened like a mouth, ready to swallow them whole, and they let it. Master Jonathan Whitmore had built his fortune on the backs of 300 slaves, but it was the rice that made him truly wealthy. Carolina gold, they called it, the grain that had transformed the Low Country into an empire of prosperity and suffering. His plantation house stood like a monument to his success, with its wide porches and imported marble, its crystal chandeliers, and polished silver. He owned land from the Ashley River to the sea, and every acre of it was watered with blood. But Jonathan Whitmore had never learned to sleep peacefully. Not since his father died and left him a legacy written in screams. Not since he'd taken a bullwhip to a pregnant woman and watched her lose her child in the dirt. Not since he'd sold a 7-year-old boy to pay a gambling debt and ignored the mother's cries for 3 days straight. His dreams were full of dark water and reaching hands, and he woke each morning with the taste of mud in his mouth. On the morning of October 13, 1832, he woke to silence. That should have been the first warning. A plantation never went silent. There should have been the sound of bells calling the slaves to work, the crack of whips, the shuffle of bare feet across wood and dirt. Instead, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the rice stalks and the distant cry of marsh birds. His overseer, a thin, cruel man named Tate, knocked on his bedroom door just after dawn. "Master Whitmore, sir. We got a problem." Jonathan pulled on his clothes and followed Tate outside. The morning air was thick with fog, and everything seemed muted, dreamlike. They walked toward the quarters, where the slave cabins stood in neat rows like tombstones in a graveyard. 14 of them gone, Tate said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. Vanished in the night. No signs of struggle. Shackles just lying there empty, like they walked right out of them. Jonathan stopped walking. "That's impossible. Those chains were forged iron. No man can slip out of iron." Tate pointed to a pile of metal near one of the cabins. The shackles lay scattered across the ground, each one intact, unbroken, but somehow empty, as if the people wearing them had simply ceased to exist. "There's more, sir." Tate's voice dropped to a whisper. "Found tracks leading to the swamp, but they don't look right." They followed the trail across the rice fields, Jonathan's boots sinking into mud that seemed to pull at him with each step. The tracks were clear at first, the bare footprints of 14 people walking together. But as they got closer to the swamp, the prints began to change. They grew deeper, as if the people making them were becoming heavier, or sinking. And then, at the water's edge, they simply stopped. Not faded, not washed away, stopped, as if the people making them had simply risen into the air or dissolved into mist. "Get the dogs," Jonathan ordered, but his voice shook. "Get every man on. The plantation. We're going after them." Tate shook his head. "Already tried, sir. Dogs won't go near the water. Started howling soon as they caught the scent, then ran back to their kennels with their tails between their legs. Won't come out for nothing." Jonathan stared at the black water, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. The swamp had always been there, a dark presence at the edge of his prosperity. His father had warned him about it, told him stories of things that lived in those waters, things that were older than slavery, older than America itself. But Jonathan had dismissed such talk as superstition. Now, looking at those empty shackles, he wasn't so sure. Offerings, he muttered, remembering something his father had once told him. The old masters used to leave offerings, food, tobacco. Sometimes. He stopped, the word dying in his throat. Sometimes what, sir? Nothing. Just get the men. We're going in. But even as he said it, Jonathan Whitmore knew they would find nothing. The swamp had taken its due, and it would not give them back. 14 souls had walked into that black water, and 14 souls had found something his money and power could never touch. Freedom. The search party that entered the swamp that morning was the largest ever assembled in Charleston County. 50 men with rifles and lanterns, bloodhounds and slave catchers, overseers and plantation owners who had too much invested in human property to let 14 slaves simply vanish. They carried rope and chains, whips and brands, everything they needed to bring back their property and make an example that would discourage others from trying the same thing. What they found instead was silence. The swamp swallowed them like a living thing. The water was black as ink, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like curtains, blocking out the sun and turning day into eternal twilight. The air was thick and humid, filled with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and wild that made their horses shy and their dogs whimper. They followed what might have been a trail for the first hour, splashing through knee-deep water, pushing aside floating logs and curtains of vegetation. But the deeper they went, the more confused they became. The path seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles, doubling back on itself. What had seemed like solid ground would suddenly give way beneath their feet, plunging them into water over their heads. What had looked like open water would reveal itself to be solid earth covered in a thin film of moisture. By midday, 3 men had turned back, claiming sickness. By evening, half the party had given up and returned to dry land. Those who remained were haggard and fearful, jumping at every sound, seeing shapes in the shadows that vanished when they turned to look directly. "This ain't natural," muttered Jake Morrison, a slave catcher who had tracked runaways across 3 states and never lost a trail. "Water don't behave like this. Trail don't just disappear into nothing." Samuel Tate wiped sweat from his forehead, though the air was cool in the swamp's shadow. "Maybe they drowned. Maybe the gators got them. Maybe we're chasing ghosts." But Jonathan Whitmore pressed on, driven by something deeper than greed or stubbornness. He felt watched. Every step he took, every breath he drew, he sensed eyes upon him, not human eyes. Something older, something that judged him and found him wanting. The water around his legs seemed to move with purpose, tugging at him, trying to pull him deeper. As night fell, they made camp on a small island of dry ground barely large enough for their fire. The flames seemed smaller here, their light swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Every man kept his rifle close, and more than one jumped at the sound of night birds calling from the canopy above. It was Morrison who saw them first. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, pointing into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "Look. Lights. 14 points of soft, phosphorescent glow moving through the water like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They bobbed and weaved between the cypress trees, never coming close enough to see clearly, never moving far enough away to dismiss as imagination. Swamp gas, Tate said, but his voice shook. Just swamp gas catching the moonlight. Jonathan said nothing. He watched the lights move in patterns that seemed almost like dance, almost like ritual, almost like celebration. And in their glow, he thought he saw faces, dark faces turned toward him with expressions of peace he had never seen in life, never allowed in life. They looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no pain, no submission, only recognition, only judgment. One of the lights drifted closer to their camp, and in its glow Jonathan Whitmore saw her clearly. Celia, the root woman, the conjurer, the one his father had warned him about, the one he should have sold years ago but never could bring himself to touch. She stood waist-deep in the black water, her head wrapped in cloth that seemed to move with its own wind, her eyes reflecting the light like stars. She looked at him for a long moment, her lips moving in words he couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Then she smiled, and Jonathan felt his heart stop beating for 3 full seconds. When it started again, she was gone. All the lights were gone, and Jonathan Whitmore knew, with the certainty of a man staring into his own grave, that he would never see his 14 slaves again. They had gone somewhere he could not follow, become something he could not own, found a freedom that existed beyond the reach of chains and law and the terrible arithmetic of human bondage. The search party returned to Magnolia Creek Plantation the next morning, empty-handed and hollow-eyed. They told no one about the lights in the swamp, about the faces they had seen, about the sound of singing that had drifted across the water in languages none of them recognized, but all of them felt in their bones. The official report listed 14 slaves as drowned, their bodies presumably taken by alligators or dissolved in the acidic water of the swamp. The insurance companies paid out their claims. New slaves were purchased to replace the lost property. Life on the plantation continued as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The other slaves felt it first. A shift in the air, a change in the way shadows fell, a sense that they were not as alone as they had been. At night they would hear singing from the direction of the swamp, old songs in the old tongue, songs of power and transformation and freedom that could not be chained. The white folks felt it too, though they couldn't name it. Plantation owners started having trouble sleeping. Overseers found their whips breaking at the handle for no reason. Slave catchers began refusing jobs that required them to venture too close to the swamp. And sometimes, on foggy nights when the moon was dark, people claimed to see lights moving through the water. 14 points of phosphorescent glow dancing among the cypress trees like souls set free. But it was the children who understood best. Slave children and white children alike would point toward the swamp and whisper about the people who lived there now, the ones who had found a way to be free that no master could touch, no law could undo, no chain could hold. They told stories of dark water that could wash away the past and transform the present, of trees that remembered everything, and roots that ran deeper than slavery, deeper than America, deeper than the memory of the ships that had brought their ancestors in chains. The Whitmores lost 3 more slaves that winter. They simply vanished one night, leaving behind empty shackles and wet footprints leading toward the water's edge. By spring, word had spread to other plantations. The Great Vanishing, they called it. Slaves would disappear in small groups, always at night, always leaving their chains behind, always heading for the swamp. The plantation owners banded together, offering rewards for information, posting guards around the slave quarters, threatening terrible punishments for anyone caught near the water after dark. But it made no difference. The swamp called, and some answered. Not many, but enough. Enough to plant a seed of fear in the hearts of men who had built their wealth on the certainty that human beings could be owned like cattle or cotton, because they had learned something that challenged everything they believed about the world. They had learned that there were places their power could not reach, transformations their money could not prevent, freedoms their chains could not hold. They had learned that the people they had stolen from Africa had brought more than just their bodies across the ocean. They had brought their spirits, their wisdom, their connection to powers older than civilization itself. And in the black water of a Carolina swamp, those powers had awakened. Celia had been preparing for this night her entire life, though she hadn't always known it. The knowledge had come to her gradually, like dawn breaking over dark water, revealed in dreams and visions, in the whispered stories of her grandmother, in the patterns she saw in the flight of birds and the movement of clouds across the moon. Her grandmother, Aisha, had been stolen from a village along the Gambia River, torn from a life where she had been a priestess, a keeper of ancient wisdom, a woman who could speak to spirits and call down rain from cloudless skies. The middle passage should have broken her, as it broke so many others. The chains, the darkness, the horror of bodies packed like cargo in the belly of a ship should have shattered her connection to the old ways forever. Instead, it had strengthened it. Water is water, Aisha had told her granddaughter years later, as they sat by the edge of a rice field watching the sun set over the low country. Don't matter if it's the Gambia or the Ashley River. Don't matter if it's blessed by ancestors or cursed by slavers. Water remembers. Water calls to water. And she had touched Celia's chest, right over her heart. We are mostly water too. That was the first lesson. That separation was an illusion. That the ocean that had carried them away from Africa was the same ocean that surrounded America. That the spirits of their ancestors lived in every drop of rain, every stream, every swamp. That power didn't come from owning land or people, but from understanding the connections that bound all living things together. The second lesson had come when Celia was 13, the night her own mother died giving birth to a baby that lived only long enough to take 3 breaths. She had watched the light fade from her mother's eyes, had seen something leave her body that was more essential than breath, more vital than blood. And then, 3 days later, standing by the rice pond where her mother used to wash clothes, she had felt that same presence settle over her like a cloak. Her mother hadn't died. She had transformed. The body is just the house, Aisha explained when Celia told her about the presence she felt, the voice she heard in the whisper of wind through Spanish moss. When the house gets too damaged, too painful to live in, the spirit finds a new home. Sometimes that home is another body. Sometimes it's the water, the trees, the very air we breathe. The white folks, they think death is an ending. For us, it's just a door. The third lesson had taken decades to learn, and it was the most dangerous one of all. It was the knowledge that transformation was possible not only in death, but in life, that the boundary between human and spirit, between flesh and power, between captivity and freedom, was thinner than most people imagined, that with the right words, the right ritual, the right understanding of the deep connections that held the world together, a person could step across that boundary while still breathing. That was what she offered the 14 that night. Not escape. Escape implied that you were still the same person, just in a different place. What she offered was transformation, the chance to become something that could never be owned, never be chained, never be sold. It required sacrifice. It required letting go of everything they had been, everything they thought they knew about the world and their place in it. It required walking into the unknown with faith that something better waited on the other side. But for people who had already lost everything, their freedom, their families, their names, their very humanity in the eyes of the law, the sacrifice felt like relief. She led them deeper into the swamp than any human being had ever gone, following paths that existed only when she needed them to exist, across water that held their weight only because she asked it to. The cypress trees grew, larger here, older, their trunks so wide that it would take a dozen people holding hands to circle them. Spanish moss hung in curtains so thick they blocked out the stars. And the water was different, warmer, alive, pulsing with its own rhythm like the heartbeat of some vast sleeping god. "This is the place," she said finally, stopping. In a clearing where 14 cypress trees formed a perfect circle around a pool of still black water. "This is where the old ones sleep, where the first spirits came when they were driven from the land, where the water remembers everything." She had them join hands around the pool, their bare feet sinking into mud that felt like velvet, like the embrace of something maternal and ancient. Then she began to sing, not in English, not in any language the white world would recognize, but in the tongue her grandmother had taught her, the words that had been carried across the ocean in the hearts of stolen people, preserved like seeds waiting for the right soil to take root. The water began to glow, soft at first, like moonlight on snow, then brighter, pulsing in rhythm with her voice, with their joined hands, with the beating of their hearts. One by one, the others began to sing too, their voices joining hers in harmonies they had never learned but somehow knew, melodies that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. And then the spirits came. They rose from the water like mist given form, like dreams made flesh. The ancestors, the ones who had died in chains, who had been thrown overboard from slave ships, who had worked themselves to death in rice fields and cotton plantations, but also the ones who had never been chained at all, the spirits of this land from before Columbus, before slavery, before the word America was ever spoken. They came in shapes that shifted and flowed, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes pure light or shadow or something between. They surrounded the circle of joined hands, and Celia felt their approval, their welcome, their recognition of what she was trying to do. This was not death. This was not suicide. This was coming home. "You ready?" she asked the 13 who stood with her, and 14 voices answered as one. Yes. The water reached for them then, rising from the pool in tendrils of liquid light, wrapping around their ankles, their waists, their necks like gentle hands. It was warm, warmer than any earthly water had a right to be. And it smelled not of decay and mud, but of rain and river stones and the green breath of growing things. Celia felt herself changing first. Her skin began to glow with the same phosphorescent, light as the water, her hair loosening from its cloth, wrapping and flowing around her head like seaweed in a current. Her body grew lighter, less solid, as if she were becoming part of the mist that hung over the swamp. But she was still herself. Still Celia. Still the woman who had learned healing and hexing at her grandmother's knee, who had helped birth babies and bury the dead, who had carried the weight of her people's pain and the hope of their freedom. She was all of that and more, now expanded beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone into something that could never be captured, never be sold, never be broken. Around her, the others were transforming too. Marcus, whose rage had burned so hot it nearly consumed him, found peace settling over him like cool water. Sarah, whose arms had ached with emptiness since her baby was taken, felt them fill with light and purpose. Old Tom, whose back was a map of scars, felt the pain drain away like water from a broken jar. They were still themselves, but they were also more than themselves. They were connected now to something vast and ancient and powerful, part of a network of spirits that stretched across time and space, that included every ancestor who had died fighting for freedom, every child who had dreamed of a better world, every person who had ever looked at injustice and said, "No more." The shackles they had worn fell away like dead skin, sinking into the mud at the bottom of the pool. The names their masters had given them dissolved like salt in water. They were free now. Free in a way that no law could grant or revoke. Free in a way that existed beyond the reach of governments or courts or the terrible machinery of slavery. They had become part of the swamp itself, part of the ancient power that had always existed here, waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right desperation to awaken it. They were the lights that travelers would see moving through the water on foggy nights. They were the voices that would sing in languages no living person remembered. They were the presence that would watch over other fugitives, other rebels, other dreamers who came seeking freedom in the dark places where civilization feared to tread. And they were the warning. The reminder that some things could not be owned, some people could not be broken, some spirits could not be chained. The search continued for months. Rewards were posted. Bloodhounds were brought in from as far away as Virginia, professional. Slave catchers combed every inch of the swamp with nets and hooks and lengths of chain. They found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no trace of 14 human beings who had simply walked into the water and vanished. But the stories spread anyway, whispered in slave quarters from Carolina to Georgia, passed along the networks of resistance that connected plantations like blood vessels in a body. The story of Celia the Conjure Woman and the 13 who followed her. The story of people who had found a freedom that existed beyond the reach of whips and chains and the brutal arithmetic of human bondage. Some masters tried to dismiss it as superstition, as the fevered imagination of ignorant people desperate for hope. But others understood the danger. This wasn't just about 14 missing slaves. This was about the idea that slavery itself might not be as permanent as they had convinced themselves. that there were powers in the world older than their laws, older than their civilization, older than the very concept of owning another human being. They began to post guards around the swamps. They forbade their slaves from going near the water after dark. They preached sermons about the sin of suicide and the virtue of patient suffering. But it made no difference. The idea had taken root, and ideas were harder to chain than bodies. More slaves began to disappear. Not in large groups like Celia's 14, but in ones and twos, always at night, always leaving their shackles behind, always heading for the dark water. The pattern spread beyond South Carolina. Slaves vanished into the great dismal swamp of Virginia, into the Okefenokee of Georgia, into the bayous of Louisiana. Always the same story. Empty chains, wet footprints leading to the water's edge, and then nothing. The authorities called it an epidemic of suicide. The plantation owners called it mass hysteria. The insurance companies raised their rates and demanded better security. But in the slave quarters, people called it by its true name, transformation. Because those who vanished were not gone. Not really. They were still there, in the phosphorescent glow that danced over dark water, in the songs that drifted from the swamps on foggy nights, in the presence that watched over other fugitives and rebels and dreamers. They had become part of something larger than themselves. Part of a power that had existed in America long before the first slave ship arrived, part of a network of resistance that stretched across time and space and the boundaries between life and death. And they were waiting. Patient as the tides, persistent as the rain, ready to welcome others who were brave enough or desperate enough to step across the boundary between captivity and freedom, between human and spirit, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. The white folks felt it in their bones, even if they couldn't name it. A shift in the balance of power, a crack in the foundation of their certainty. For the first time since the beginning of slavery in America, they understood that there were some things they could not control, some people they could not break, some freedoms they could not steal, and in the deepest part of their hearts, in the place where nightmares are born, they began to fear that the day might come when all their slaves would remember what Celia had taught her 14, that chains could only hold the body, that transformation was always possible, and that there were places in this world where the old powers still held sway, where justice was older than law, where freedom was not something to be granted but something to be claimed. The transformation of the 14 was not an ending but a beginning. In the months that followed their vanishing, the very nature of slavery in the Low Country began to change. Not the legal structure. That would take a war and an amendment to the Constitution to alter. But the spiritual and psychological foundation that held the system together started to crack like wood in a fire. It began with dreams. Slaves across the region reported the same visions. Dark water that glowed with its own light, voices singing in forgotten languages, and 14 figures beckoning from the edge of vision. The dreams were not frightening. They were hopeful. They were invitations. Master Whitmore tried to control the spread of the story by forbidding his remaining slaves from speaking about the vanished 14. He ordered whippings for anyone caught, mentioning Celia's name. But you cannot whip away a dream, cannot chain a vision, cannot auction off hope itself. The transformation spread in other ways too. Overseers began reporting incidents they couldn't explain. Whips that broke at the handle for no reason. Shackles that somehow came unlocked in the night. Slaves who seemed to move through the plantation like ghosts, appearing where they were, needed, vanishing when pursuit came too close. The boundaries between the possible and impossible began to blur. Sarah Watson, who worked in the kitchen of a neighboring plantation, swore she saw Celia one morning at dawn, standing by the well, drawing water in a bucket that never seemed to fill. When Sarah blinked, the apparition was gone, but the well had overflowed, clean water running across the packed earth like a blessing. Marcus Thompson, a field hand on the Riverside plantation, claimed he heard his name called one night by a voice he recognized from childhood. His sister's voice, though she had been sold away 10 years earlier. Following the sound, he found himself at the edge of the swamp, where 14 points of light danced among the cypress trees like stars fallen to earth. These stories multiplied and evolved, passed from plantation to plantation along the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. Each telling added new details, new meanings, new possibilities. The 14 became more than people who had vanished. They became symbols of a truth that slavery had tried to bury, but could never quite kill. That the human spirit was ultimately unconquerable. Master Whitmore hired a preacher to come preach to his slaves about the sin of despair and the virtue of accepting God's will. But Reverend Matthews, a thin man with nervous eyes and a Bible bound in cracked leather, found his words falling flat. When he spoke of patience and submission, his audience listened with expressions of polite skepticism. When he warned against false prophets and heathen magic, he saw smiles pass between faces in the candlelight. After the service, an old woman named Ruth approached him. She was ancient, her hair white as cotton, her back bent from decades of labor, but her eyes were sharp as flint. "Reverend," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you ever read about Moses?" Matthews nodded. "Of course. He led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt." "That's right. Led them right into the water, didn't he?" Red Sea parted and they walked across on dry land. Ruth's smile was enigmatic. "Now you suppose that water was different from any other water? You suppose Moses had some special magic the good Lord didn't give to nobody else?" The preacher opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Something in the old woman's tone, in the way the other slaves had gathered around to listen, made him suddenly uncomfortable. "I mean," Ruth continued, "seems to me like the Lord been using water to set folks free for a long time. Noah's flood, Moses at the Red Sea, Jesus walking on the waves. Maybe," she leaned closer, "maybe some of us just got to learn how to listen to what the water's trying to tell us." Reverend Matthews left the plantation that same night and never returned. He told Master Whitmore that the slaves were beyond saving, corrupted by heathen beliefs too deeply rooted to extract. But in truth, he was afraid of the certainty he had seen in Ruth's eyes, the sense that she knew something he didn't. Something that made his seminary training feel as fragile as paper in the rain. The fear was spreading beyond the plantations, too. In Charleston, wealthy merchants who had built their fortunes on rice and human labor began having trouble sleeping. They reported dreams of dark water and glowing figures, of voices calling their names in languages they didn't recognize. Some, tried to soothe their consciences with charity, donating to missions for civilizing the slaves, supporting programs for gradual emancipation. But the dreams continued. Dr. Hamilton Pierce, who owned shares in 3 plantations and had performed medical examinations on hundreds of slaves to determine their market value, began drinking heavily after a recurring nightmare in which 14 pairs of eyes stared at him from the depths of a black pool. In his dream, they never spoke, never moved, just watched him with expressions of infinite patience, as if they were waiting for something. Judge Samuel Richardson, who had sentenced more runaway slaves than any other magistrate in the state, developed a nervous condition that made his hands shake whenever he held his gavel. He claimed it was gout, but his wife noticed that it only happened during trials involving fugitive slaves. The shaking would start as soon as the accused was brought into the courtroom, and it wouldn't stop until after the sentence was pronounced. Even Governor Robert Hayne, who had built his political career on defending the rights of slaveholders, found himself waking in the middle of the night with the taste of swamp water in his mouth and the sound of singing in his ears. He ordered increased patrols around all the state's major swamps and wetlands, claiming it was to prevent disorder and disruption. But privately, he wrote in his journal about influences beyond the natural order and powers that seem to transcend our understanding of law and authority. The truth was that the transformation Celia had begun was spreading far beyond the 14 who had followed her into the water. It was becoming something larger, something that touched not only the enslaved, but their enslavers as well. Because the revelation that some forms of freedom existed beyond the reach of law and force was as terrifying to those who benefited from slavery as it was liberating to those who suffered under it. The system they had built depended on the absolute conviction that human beings could be reduced to property, that the power to buy and sell and own was backed by the ultimate authority of God and nature and civilization itself. But the story of the 14 suggested something different, that there were older authorities, deeper powers, truer freedoms than anything their courts or churches or governments could grant or revoke. And if that was true, if transformation was really possible, if the boundary between captivity and freedom was thinner than they had imagined, if the spirits of Africa and America could meet in dark water and create something new and unconquerable, then everything they had built their world on was as fragile as morning mist. By winter, 17 more slaves had vanished from plantations throughout the Low Country. Always the same pattern: empty shackles, footprints leading to water, and then nothing. The Charleston Mercury ran editorials warning of a contagion of despair spreading through the slave population. The city council offered rewards for information about agitators and insurrectionists who might be encouraging such behavior, but they could not name what they were really fighting, because they could not admit that it existed. They could not acknowledge that their slaves had found a form of resistance that existed beyond rebellion, beyond escape, beyond anything their laws or weapons could address. They could not say that the people they had stolen from Africa had brought with them powers older than Christianity, older than civilization, older than the very concept of ownership itself. So they blamed outside agitators and foreign influences and the corrupting effects of education. They passed new laws restricting the movement of free blacks and the teaching of reading to slaves. They imported more bloodhounds and hired more slave catchers and built higher walls around their plantations. But the transformations continued, and in the deepest part of their hearts, the white folks of South Carolina began to understand that they were no longer fighting against people they could whip into submission or sell at auction. They were fighting against something that had no body to chain, no name to write in a ledger, no price that could be calculated in dollars and cents. They were fighting against the memory of freedom itself, and that was a war they could never win. The swamp had become a cathedral of whispers, a sanctuary where the impossible grew roots and flowered into reality. In the months following the Great Vanishing, as the white folks called it, the Blackwater Swamp transformed into something that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. The cypress trees grew larger, their roots deeper, their branches reaching toward each other to form a canopy that filtered sunlight into patterns that resembled ancient symbols. The water itself had changed. Where once it had been merely dark, now it held depths that seemed infinite. Fishermen who had worked these waters for generations reported that their nets came up empty, not because there were no fish, but because the fish they caught dissolved into points of light when exposed to sunlight. Hunters claimed that the alligators in this part of the swamp had grown larger and more intelligent, their eyes reflecting not animal cunning, but something approaching wisdom. But it was the sounds that truly marked the transformation. Music drifted from the water at all hours, not the work songs or spirituals that echoed from the plantations, but something older, more complex, harmonies and languages that had never been written down, rhythms that seemed to emerge from the heartbeat of the earth itself. The songs were audible for miles, carrying across the rice fields and cotton rows, finding their way into the dreams of anyone who heard them. Celia had become the conductor of this impossible orchestra. Those who claimed to have seen her described a figure that seemed to be made of moonlight and mist, sometimes solid enough to cast a shadow, sometimes transparent as morning fog. She moved through the swamp with the confidence of someone who had found her true home, gathering others to her not through coercion or argument, but through simple invitation. The 14 who had followed her first were no longer quite human, but they were not quite spirits either. They existed in a state between worlds, anchored to the physical realm by their love for those they had left behind, elevated beyond it by their connection to powers that predated slavery, predated America, predated the very concept of one human being owning another. Marcus had become a guardian of sorts, appearing to runaway slaves who lost their way in the dark water, guiding them either to safety on dry land or deeper into the swamp where other transformations awaited. Sarah had evolved into something like a mother spirit, her arms finally full, not with her lost child, but with all the children who had been torn from their families by the auction block. She could be seen sometimes at the edges of plantations, singing lullabies that carried dreams of freedom to babies who had been born into bondage. Old Tom had found his voice again, literally and figuratively. In life, his back had been so scarred by whippings that he could barely speak above a whisper. In his transformed state, he sang with the power of a river in flood, his voice carrying stories of endurance and resistance across the landscape. His songs reached the ears of field hands bent over rice stalks, house servants polishing silver they would never own, children playing in the dirt outside slave cabins. And in those voices, they heard their own stories validated, their own pain acknowledged, their own hopes affirmed. The other 11 had found their own forms of purpose and power. Some became messengers, carrying information between separated families faster than any horse or riverboat. Others became healers, their touch able to soothe ailments that had no cure in the white world's medicine. A few became warriors, not in the sense of fighting with weapons, but in the deeper sense of standing guard over the dreams and aspirations of their people. Together, they formed a network of resistance that operated according to rules the white world could not understand or counter. They were not planning a rebellion in the conventional sense. There would be no attack on plantation houses, no seizure of weapons, no attempt to overthrow the government. Instead, they were doing something far more subversive. They were demonstrating that slavery itself was an illusion, that the power to own another human being was ultimately meaningless in the face of spiritual transformation. Every slave who vanished into the swamp was a crack in the foundation of the peculiar institution. Every story that spread through the quarters was a seed of possibility planted in fertile ground. Every dream inspired by their example was a small act of revolution, a refusal to accept that the current state of things was permanent or natural or ordained by God. The plantation owners fought back with increasing desperation. They hired witch doctors from New Orleans to counter what they assumed was voodoo or hoodoo. They brought in ministers from as far away as Boston to preach about the dangers of false prophets and heathen magic. They offered rewards for information about agitators and insurrectionists who might be spreading dangerous ideas among their property. But they were fighting shadows, battling an enemy that existed in the realm of spirit and symbol rather than flesh and blood. How do you chain a dream? How do you auction off hope? How do you whip a transformation that exists beyond the reach of physical pain? Master Whitmore, who had lost more slaves than any other plantation owner in the region, hired a man named Isaiah Cross to solve his problem. Cross was a professional slave breaker, someone who specialized in crushing the spirits of rebellious or difficult slaves. He arrived at Magnolia Creek with a reputation for being able to break anyone, no matter how strong-willed or defiant. Cross was a small, neat man who dressed in black and spoke in whispers. He carried no whip, used no chains. His method was psychological rather than physical, based on a deep understanding of the human need for hope and dignity. He would identify whatever gave a slave strength, faith, family, dreams of freedom, cultural identity, and then systematically destroy it. But when he tried to apply his methods to the remaining slaves at Magnolia Creek, he found them strangely immune to his techniques. They listened to his threats with expressions of polite interest, as if he were describing weather in some distant country. When he tried to identify their sources of strength so he could attack them, he discovered that their power came from something he could not touch. Their connection to the 14 who had vanished, their certainty that transformation was possible, their knowledge that there were forms of freedom that existed beyond his reach. After 2 weeks of failure, Cross requested a private meeting with Master Whitmore. They met in the plantation office, surrounded by ledgers that recorded the buying and selling of human beings with the same clinical precision used for livestock or farm equipment. "Sir," Cross began, his usual confidence noticeably shaken, "I regret to inform you that my methods are proving inadequate to the current situation." Whitmore poured himself a glass of bourbon. His hands were shaking slightly. "What do you mean, inadequate? I've heard you can break anyone." "That's been true in the past, yes. But these people..." Cross paused, searching for words. They're not afraid of death, sir. They're not afraid of pain. They're not even afraid of separation from their families, because they believe, truly believe, that such separation is temporary. They think they can be reunited with their loved ones in some spiritual realm where you and I have no authority. Superstition, Whitmore muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, but superstition that provides more comfort than reality has proved remarkably resistant to correction. Cross stood up, smoothing his black coat. I've heard stories, sir. Stories about lights in the swamp, about voices singing in unknown languages, about slaves who claim to have been visited by the spirits of those who vanished. Now, I'm not saying I believe such things, but I am saying that people who believe in miracles are very difficult to break. Whitmore stared out the window toward the rice fields where his remaining slaves continued their work with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. They performed their tasks without complaint, without resistance, without any sign of the sullen resentment that usually marked slaves who were planning trouble. But there was something in their eyes, something in the way they moved, that suggested they were merely going through the motions while their true selves existed elsewhere. "What do you recommend?" he asked finally. Cross was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, sir, I recommend you sell them, all of them, as quickly as possible. Whatever's happening here, it's spreading, and I don't think it can be stopped by conventional means." But Master Whitmore couldn't bring himself to sell his remaining slaves, not because he had grown fond of them, but because doing so would be an admission of defeat. It would be acknowledging that there were powers in the world beyond his control, forces that could not be bought or sold or whipped into submission. So he kept them, and they kept working, and the stalemate continued. But everyone knew it was temporary. The transformation that had begun in the swamp was spreading, slowly but inevitably, like water seeping through the cracks in a dam. And sooner or later, the dam would break entirely. The children were the first to understand what was really happening. Slave children and white children alike began playing new games, making up stories about people who could walk on water and disappear into mist. They drew pictures in the dirt of figures surrounded by light, sang songs in made-up languages that sounded surprisingly like the music that drifted from the swamp at night. Their parents tried to discourage such play, afraid of where it might lead. But children are naturally attuned to magic, naturally accepting of possibilities that adults have learned to dismiss. They understood instinctively what their elders struggled to accept, that the world was larger and stranger and more full of hope than the laws and customs of South Carolina allowed for. And in their games and songs and pictures, they were preparing for a future that their parents could not yet imagine. A future where transformation was possible, where freedom could not be bought or sold, where the human spirit proved stronger than chains. The winter of 1833 was the coldest in decades. Ice formed on the rice fields, and snow fell on Charleston for the first time in living memory. But in the Blackwater swamp, the water remained warm, glowing with its own phosphorescent light, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of everyone who heard it. It was during this winter that the Great Convergence began. Slaves from plantations across South Carolina started making their way toward the swamp, not in groups but individually, following dreams and visions and voices that called to them in the dark hours before dawn. They came not just from the low country, but from the up country as well, from cotton fields and tobacco farms, from city houses and rural cabins. They brought with them stories from their own communities, tales of impossible occurrences, unexplained phenomena, small miracles that suggested the boundaries between the possible and impossible were becoming thinner throughout the region. A house slave in Colombia claimed she could understand the language of birds, and that they brought her messages from relatives sold away years earlier. A field hand near Greenville swore that his late father appeared to him in dreams, teaching him songs of power that could make crops grow faster and overseers forget their anger. These stories wove together into a larger narrative, a collective revelation that something fundamental was changing in the nature of reality itself. The transformation that had begun with Celia and her 14 was spreading like ripples in a pond, affecting not just those who directly participated, but everyone who heard their story, everyone who allowed themselves to believe that another way of being might be possible. Master Whitmore watched this gathering with growing alarm. From his bedroom window, he could see the lights in the swamp multiplying night after night, points of phosphorescent glow that moved through the dark water like stars fallen to earth. He hired guards to patrol the borders of his plantation, but they reported that the incoming slaves seemed to simply materialize out of thin air, bypassing all physical barriers as if they existed in a different dimension entirely. By February, there were nearly 100 lights dancing in the swamp each night. By March, 200. The music that drifted from the water had evolved into something resembling a symphony, complex harmonies in dozens of languages, creating rhythms that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone who heard them. The white authorities tried to organize a massive raid to break up what they assumed was a gathering of runaway slaves planning some sort of insurrection. But when search parties entered the swamp, they found nothing but empty water and singing birds. The lights would disappear as soon as they approached, only to reappear behind them, surrounding them, leading them in circles until they emerged, exhausted and confused at the same spot where they had entered. Some of the searchers reported seeing figures moving through the water, translucent forms that seemed to be made of moonlight and mist. Others claimed to have heard voices speaking in perfect English, offering invitations to join them in a place where chains could not hold and masters could not follow. A few even admitted to feeling tempted by these offers, to experiencing a moment of longing for whatever freedom these impossible beings had found. Dr. Pierce, the physician who had examined slaves for auction, volunteered to join one of the search parties, hoping that his medical training might help him understand what was happening. But when he entered the swamp, he was confronted by something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of life and death. In a clearing surrounded by ancient cypress trees, he encountered Sarah, the same woman who had followed Celia into the water months earlier. But she was transformed, luminous, her empty arms now filled with children who seemed to be made of light and love and dreams of freedom. She looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only infinite sadness. "Doctor," she said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through Spanish moss, "you examined me once, declared me fit for breeding, put a price on my womb like I was livestock." She paused, and one of the light children in her arms reached toward him with tiny glowing fingers. "Do you remember?" Pierce tried to speak but found his throat closed, with emotion he couldn't name. He did remember. He remembered reducing this woman to a collection of marketable attributes, writing reports that described her reproductive potential as if she were a mare or a sow. He remembered the look in her eyes that day. Not defiance, not anger, but a kind of patient sorrow that had haunted his dreams ever since. "I remember," he whispered finally. Sarah smiled, and in that smile was forgiveness so pure it made him weep. "Then you understand why we had to change, why we couldn't stay in a world where love could be bought and sold, where children could be stolen from their mothers, where the worth of a human being could be calculated in dollars and cents." She gestured to the other figures moving through the clearing, the transformed ones, the ones who had found a way to exist beyond the reach of slavery's definitions. "We're not angry, Doctor. We're just free. Free in a way that your laws can't touch, your chains can't hold, your auctions can't price." Pierce left the swamp that night a changed man. He could not return to his old practice, could not bring himself to examine another human being as if they were livestock. He eventually left South Carolina entirely, moving north where he dedicated his remaining years to the abolition movement. But he never spoke publicly about what he had seen in the swamp, afraid that no one would believe him, afraid that they would. The transformation was becoming contagious in ways that had nothing to do with disease and everything to do with the power of possibility. As word spread of the gathering in the swamp, slaves throughout the South began to experience their own versions of the phenomenon. Some reported visits from deceased relatives who taught them songs of power and protection. Others claimed to have developed abilities that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience, the power to become invisible to overseers, to communicate across vast distances without words, to heal wounds that should have been fatal. These individual transformations were small, subtle, easily dismissed as imagination or coincidence. But they added up to something larger, a shift in the fundamental relationship between the enslaved and their enslavers. Suddenly, there were slaves who could not be broken, could not be intimidated, could not be reduced to the status of property no matter what violence was visited upon them. The white authorities responded with increasing brutality, as if they could whip and burn and lynch their way back to the certainty they had lost. But their violence only seemed to accelerate the process of transformation, each act of cruelty, creating new martyrs, new spirits, new points of light in the growing constellation of resistance. By spring, the Blackwater Swamp had become a place of pilgrimage for enslaved people throughout the region. They came not necessarily to vanish as Celia's original 14 had done, but to witness the miracle, to touch something that existed beyond the boundaries of their oppression, to carry back to their own communities the knowledge that transformation was possible. And they did carry it back. In their songs and stories, in their dreams and prayers, in the way they moved through their daily tasks with a new kind of dignity that no amount of violence could strip away. The swamp had become more than a place. It had become an idea, a state of mind, a form of resistance that could not be mapped or patrolled or contained. Master Whitmore finally understood that he was fighting something that could not be defeated by conventional means. On a warm April morning, he walked to the edge of his property where it bordered the swamp and stood looking out over the dark water. In daylight, it looked ordinary enough, just cypress trees and Spanish moss, water birds and floating logs. But he knew that appearances were deceiving, that beneath the surface lay something that challenged everything his world was built on. "Celia," he called out, his voice carrying across the water. "I know you can hear me. I know you're out there." For a moment, there was only the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of a heron. Then she appeared, rising from the water like mist given form, her face serene, her eyes filled with a kind of light he had never seen in life. "Master Whitmore," she said, and there was no mockery in the title, only acknowledgement of what he had been, what he no longer was. "You finally ready to listen?" "What do you want?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Celia smiled, and in that smile was the accumulated wisdom of generations. "I want what I always wanted. Freedom. Not just for me, not just for the ones who followed me, but for all of us. For the ones still in chains and the ones wearing different kinds of chains." She looked at him directly, and he felt her gaze penetrating to the depths of his soul. "Even for you, if you're ready to let go of what you think you own." "You're asking me to give up everything," he said. "I'm asking you to find out who you are when you're not defined by what you own," she replied. "When you're not Master Whitmore, owner of 300 slaves and 3,000 acres, but just Jonathan, a human being trying to find his way in a world bigger and stranger than he ever imagined." She began to fade back into the mist from which she had emerged. "The choice is yours, Jonathan. But remember, transformation is always possible. For all of us." And then she was gone, leaving him alone at the edge of the water with the most terrifying and liberating realization of his life. That everything he had built his identity on was as fragile and temporary as morning fog. That night, Master Whitmore did something that shocked his neighbors and changed the course of his family's history forever. He gathered his remaining slaves in the great hall of his plantation house and spoke words that no South Carolina master had ever spoken before. "I'm freeing you," he said simply. "All of you. As of this moment, you are no longer my property. You are no longer anyone's property." The response was not celebration, but stunned silence. Freedom offered by a master was different from freedom claimed by spirits in a swamp. It came with complications, with uncertainties, with the knowledge that legal documents could be revoked as easily as they were written. But it was also a beginning, a crack in the wall of slavery that would eventually help bring the whole structure tumbling down. Because Master Whitmore was not the only one who had been transformed by his encounter with the impossible. Across the South, other plantation owners were having their own moments of revelation, their own conversations with spirits who challenged them to see their slaves as human beings rather than property. The Civil War was still 30 years away, but the war for the soul of America had already begun, and it had started not with armies or politicians or the grand gestures of history, but with 14 people who refused to accept that slavery was permanent, who walked into dark water and emerged as something that could never be chained. Their transformation rippled outward in ways that could not be measured or predicted, touching lives and changing hearts across generations. In the stories that were told and retold, in the songs that were sung and remembered, in the dreams that inspired new dreamers, the 14 lived on. They had found a form of freedom that existed beyond the reach of law or custom or violence. And in finding it, they had shown others the way. Not everyone would choose transformation as radical as theirs. Not everyone needed to disappear into the swamp to find their power. But everyone who heard their story was changed by it, expanded by it, liberated by the simple knowledge that such transformation was possible. The lights still dance in the Blackwater swamp on certain nights when the moon is dark and the air is still. Fishermen report seeing them. Historians dismiss them. Tourists come hoping to glimpse them. But they appear only to those who understand what they represent. Proof that the human spirit is ultimately unconquerable. That freedom is not something that can be granted or revoked by others, and that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to step beyond the boundaries of what the world tells them is real. Celia and her 14 had become more than people who had vanished. They had become a promise, a reminder, a light in dark water that continues to shine, calling to anyone who is ready to discover what lies beyond the chains that bind us, beyond the definitions that limit us, beyond the small, safe world we think we know. Their story is not just history, it is invitation, it is prophecy. It is the eternal reminder that no matter how impossible freedom seems, no matter how permanent oppression appears, transformation is always just one step away, out there in the dark water, waiting for those with eyes to see and courage to follow. And if you find yourself by the water's edge on a foggy night, listening to songs in languages you don't recognize, seeing lights that shouldn't exist, remember, you are not hallucinating. You are witnessing the truth that Celia taught her 14, the truth that terrified masters and liberated slaves, the truth that continues to echo across time and space and the boundaries between possible and impossible. You are witnessing the power of transformation itself. And if you're ready, if you're truly ready, it might just be calling your name. If this story stirred something in your soul, if you carry in your blood the memory of those who walked into dark water and emerged as light, if you know that freedom is not something to be granted but something to be claimed, then subscribe to this channel. Share this truth with others who need to hear it. And remember, the 14 are still out there, still dancing in the phosphorescent glow, still singing songs of transformation, still proving that no chain can hold the human spirit forever. Their light never dims, their song never ends, and their invitation to step beyond the boundaries of the possible and discover what lies waiting in the dark water of transformation remains open to anyone brave enough to answer.